by reading you some of the fine things I know about Andy. Andy Duncan is a writer, teacher, journalist, and connoisseur of weirdness, which should make this pretty much fit with what we're up to. His honors include a Nebula Award, a Theodore Sturgeon Memorial Award, 3 World Fantasy Awards, and awards from Maryland State Arts Council and the Science Fiction Research Association. His latest collection is An Agent of Utopia, which I personally have on my bookshelf from Small Beard Press. He narrates 9 stories on the recorded book audio edition. His ongoing nonfiction project, Weird Western Maryland, is online, and we will share that link somewhere in the notes of this interview. A former board member of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association, he lives in Maryland's mountains as a tenured writing professor. Welcome, Andy.
It did. Well, thank you.
Maybe we can start. We're going to be talking about Tanith Lee and your connection to Tanith. But maybe we could just jump on an aside for a moment, which is people often think that authors are these isolated individuals who are working alone, and they just come up with these words and then send them to a publisher, and off it goes into the world. I know for Tanith Lee that she considered her husband and partner, John Kane, also her partner in her creative process. They would discuss story ideas. He would actually suggest story ideas. He would create artwork that would inspire her. They both had a visual arts background. So one, to start with you for a little bit in your work, do you have the same sort of connection to other people you're doing your fiction or any of your other writing, I suppose?
I feel a lot of connection. I feel that all my networks, my students, my colleagues, all the authors, many of them long dead or far distant, that I read or have read. I mean, all this is such an important part of the idea generating process, of the validation process, of the encouragement, of the inspiration. And I tell this to my students, even though this time of year they probably don't believe me because they're sort of tired of me and they wish I would I would go away and leave them alone these last 5 weeks of the semester. But I always tell them that I learn a lot more from them than they learn from me. And with Tanith Lee, whereas there are so many writers of her generation that I have had the chance to meet and get to know and talk to and learn from and become friends with, and certainly mentees with. I've been very lucky in that respect. But she was not one of them. She mostly stuck to the UK. And when I was starting in the field in the 90s, I was and am very seldom in Europe. I had a fleeting encounter with her at a World Con. I believe it was the Baltimore World Con, where I was on the ballot a couple of times, and I was completely new. Nobody had heard of me. And 2 of the few people who had heard of me were Charles Sheffield and Nancy Kress, who were together at the time. Nancy had been my week 1 Clarion West instructor. And in my memory, I was standing in a hallway talking to Charles, who was in full pirate regalia for his Toastmaster gig that night, and complete with the makeup and a false mole in Regency fashion, the pigtails, the knee breeches, everything.
Why
He
the
looked
false
great.
mole?
I don't just, why not? And so I was standing there talking to him, and we looked down the hall, and here came Nancy Kress, Tanith Lee, and Esther Friesner, all in full Regency costume with the bustles and the fabrics trailing behind them, and they were bearing down on us, the three of them, uh, and and uh, Charles and I stopped whatever we were saying, and Charles said, "Ah, the weird sisters," and then the three of them swarmed around us, and suddenly Charles and I, we no longer we were no longer in charge of anything. And so they were all talking at once and telling us what we were to do next and where we were supposed to be and this and that. And they were fussing over Charles and fussing over me. And I thought, well, okay, this is a good place to be. This field is the place where people you've been reading for years just sort of come up to you in full cosplay mode and begin like fixing your hair and trying to, help you look a little bit more presentable. But that really was just about our only actual encounter, I think. But yes, I think the networking, the influence, the inspiration of this morass of people we're with, including people from the 19th century, including, I know one young writer I was talking to who is uh, hugely influenced by Catherine L. Moore, and their lives did not overlap at all. But C.L. Moore is as much a presence for her as anybody, and Tanith was certainly a big presence for me, reading all those science fiction, fantasy, and horror anthologies in the 70s and 80s. Because I started with Stephen King and Ray Bradbury, it was hard to stop the reading.
Well, I have a sense from the bookshelves behind you that that is very much continued on. I have a question for you. If you were reading Tanith in the 70s and 80s, were you reading her as a teenager? Was she one of the early sort of science fiction and fantasy authors that you read? And how did
Well,
you
I
come
was born
across
in
her?
I was in anthologies. I brought a stack of them with me up here to the office, just sort of as, just for their magic power, their resonance at my elbow. But uh, I was haunting the public library my entire life in Batesburg, South Carolina. I was born in '64. So by the time we're talking mid '70s, around the time Star Wars came out, I was reading everything that had the little rocket ship symbol on it in the spine at the library. And so that's how I was reading Stephen R. Donaldson's original Thomas Covenant trilogy. And I was
Oh, yeah,
reading
yeah.
the later I was reading the later Philip K. Dick novels. And I was reading Le Guin and all these other people that were publishing at the time, and Bradbury, and that got me into reading the anthologies, the year's best, and so forth. And in adulthood, particularly when I realized I was going to be doing this as sort of a career, and it was all tax deductible, I've started systematically acquiring a lot of those books and anthologies that I was reading at the time, with no idea that I would ever be a writer of any kind, much less a writer that deserved to be in such volumes. Um, and so I can't claim for the anthologies I had any great awareness of one writer versus another. But when we first started talking about this project, I went and started pulling anthologies down from the shelf. And my goodness, there were a lot of Tanith Lee stories in those books that I was reading all along. And and uh, um, and I think when I went back and was rereading so much of this after Clarion West, after I knew that I was not just a journalist, not just a nonfiction writer, but a fiction writer too, and a fiction writer in these vineyards, that the stories that were really hitting me, that were really making an impact, Tanith was one of those writers. And what I wish I had done, of course, as we all wish, is that I had just dropped her a note and say, I just reread blah blah. Certainly after Worldcon, I had a little bit of reason to do that. But you don't, you just expect people will always be with you for whatever reason. And we don't praise each other enough, I don't think. I mean, we blurb each other to death, but if we don't often like send a little personal note to say, I really like this thing here that you did, and you should keep doing it. Hope all's well.
All right, Andy
People have
Duncan,
done
I will
that to me.
say I read An Agent of Utopia, and it was really good, and I really appreciate your work, and I hope you continue and are doing well.
well, well, all right. Thank you very much. But the um uh, Tanith was so much a part of the uh rewriting, revisioning of the fairy tale of the Gothic. Um, and that was evident in so much of her work and so many of the anthologies in the 80s and 90s, all the Ellen Datlow and Terry Windling anthologies, not just their overt fairy tale anthologies like Snow White and Blood Red, which those books that Tanith was a staple of, but even in their terrific, never bettered year's best fantasy and horror, those annual volumes, the argument that was being made through all those selections and juxtapositions in the books was so much designed to make us rethink what fantasy was, what horror was. And Tanith was so much a part of that. And yet I didn't really encounter her as a novelist. I didn't even encounter her as an author of story collections. I encountered her as a name in a table of contents in an anthology. So it's very interesting that you're doing this tribute anthology with multiple short stories in it, because that is how so many of us encountered her work to begin with. There were not very many magazines at the time. I was unaware as a teenager of any of them other than the Twilight Zone magazine, because I recognized the brand. And I think Ted Klein was editing it initially, and then later Tappan King was editing it. But I did not know of Asimov's, of Analog, of FNSF. That came later. But until the web zines came along, we were down to about 5 or 6 really magazines in the field. And so you pretty much had to encounter the stories in reprint form in anthologies, and particularly the proliferation of Year's Best, even to see them.
I find it interesting that you started with just her being part of a sort of like weft and weave of various authors. And in what ways did I wanted to know in what ways she stood out for you. My first question. Who is she to you as an
The,
author? Or who was she to you at the time?
there is there's so many trends, there's so many through lines, breadcrumbs, whatever you want, whatever metaphor you want. There's so many paths through our genre for people to take now, and for people always to have taken, and for us to take as we look back, as we're reading stuff and talking about it. But one thing, one great artificial division that used to hear about all the time, not so much now, although I think we still practice it in our reading choices and our buying choices as readers. between the the work that foregrounded the prose, foregrounded the language, foregrounded the sound, and the work that foregrounded the plot, the skiffy element, the excitement, the page turning. That this was never exactly a binary switch is evident to anybody that's ever read anything. You know, Stephen King does both those things terrifically, as Nancy Kress does, as Peter Straub did, et cetera, et cetera. But you can't read even a paragraph of Tanith Lee without thinking, okay, this is a voice. This is somebody that is crafting the sentences, and the sentences work. The sentences work orally. Read the stories aloud. You can do this. They lend themselves to that. And I know nothing about her story. I know nothing about her methodology, but I would be very surprised if she were not if she had not read some of these things as she was composing them out loud. And who knows, given the close collaboration with her partner that you were talking about earlier, who knows, may have read them to him.
I wouldn't be
In part,
surprised. It's a question.
I
Yeah.
don't, I don't know. But and that also, by the way, raises one of the things that fascinates me, the uncredited collaborators, because I think we all have them. Gene Wolfe used to say that he was surprised that literary critics did not spend more time writing about writers in the context of the people they hung out with. Because he said, even if those don't seem very obvious on the face of it, they are absolutely in conversation with each other. That makes sense when it's Tolkien and Lewis, but it you know, for it might make less sense for me and Ted Chiang, you know.
Mhm.
But anyway, the but the and and she was so influenced by the 19th century writers and the early 20th century writers that she was both paying tribute to and also sort of sending up. Not parody, um, but sort of rethinking, re-envisioning,
She was having a
rewriting in
conversation with.
conversation with. She was in conversation. I was just looking Jim Gunn, my late friend Jim Gunn, when he in his Road to Science Fiction series. These are great anthologies. His volume 5 was The British Way, 24 stories, two of them by Brian Aldiss, who got a twofer. But it starts back with the an excerpt from the Battle of Dorking. There's one you have to be a literary critic to know about.
Yeah.
But of these 24 stories in here, a whopping 2 are by women. Josephine Saxton being one and Tanith being the other. But he points out that this Tanith Lee story is in conversation with a Frederick Brown story, a famous Frederick Brown story. It takes the 2-sentence Frederick Brown story titled Knock about the last man on earth and retells it about the last woman on earth. Behind Lee's door is a fairy tale. And he's absolutely right. And Jim, who had read everything, this resonated with him. And because I am John Kessel's boy, I am a relentlessly intertextual reader and writer. I love the conversation. And so as a writer, I appreciated these things about Tanith that I had just sort of missed as a kid. The language of it, the foregrounding of the language, and also the conversation with the stuff that has gone before. And she knew that the readers of these magazines and these anthologies were somewhat aware of these traditions, these tropes, these texts that she was in conversation with, even if it was just through conversation. You know, they were not all literary critics, but they were all fans and at least aspiring writers. And so she could wade in and have things to say, have contributions to make.
I'll be honest, I'm curious because you and I are very different people, right? And our entrance into genre is very different, actually. You know, I was finding all sorts of interesting books just because I was a kid and it sounded good and I would just get it, or because I forgot to like cancel the automatic book of the month that would just show up on my doorstep. And then I was like, oh, fuck, though I wouldn't have said fuck at the time. And I and I ended up reading it. You know, there's a way in which, for me at least, because partly because I'm a woman, and partly, as you mentioned at that time, I'm a little younger than you, probably less than I'd like to admit, but a little bit. And and so, but it was still very much I would be, without realizing it as a kid, transposing a lot of the protagonists into women, you know, because there
Yeah.
weren't any. And so I was the
Mhm.
protagonist. I was a kid reading an adventure story or doing whatever I was doing. And so for me, whenever I found all, you know, whether it was Anne McCaffrey or Tanith Lee, Andre Norton, um, well, a little bit of Ursula Le Guin, they were people who were giving me something I wasn't finding elsewhere. So it wasn't, the language was there, and I definitely I love voice, I love line level stuff, all of that, always have. Well, maybe not when I was 12, but I pretend that I did. And but in terms of your perspective, did you notice something different about her point of view? Or at what point did you begin to notice that she is one of these few female writers, and what she brought to the table for people like me was entrance into the world in a different way. But I don't know, you are, you know, you had a much broader landscape to be working with.
I did, but it was terribly blinkered. It was terribly canonical in an
Yeah.
age when all the can when in decades when all the canons were really exclusive, and most of the human population and the human culture creators were left out of the various canons for various reasons. Um, and the example I always give, and I still have it at home, I carry it around and drop it on the table during class. Rick, when I was an undergrad in the early 1980s, the British literature text for our intro class, our required intro class, was the Norton Anthology of English Literature, the one volume major authors edition. And it had a montage, a slideshow, in effect, on the cover of little mugshots or illustrations of all the authors therein. And it was and I keep this because it was a major authors edition that left out Mary Shelley, Christina Rossetti, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Virginia Woolf,
Holy
Aphra
shit.
Behn, and I could just keep naming and naming and naming and naming Doris Lessing and so forth. And in fact, what do you know? All the women. It was an all male major authors edition of the Norton Anthology, and the editors included a woman. And my professor as an undergrad, who was marching us through this book, was a woman. Was there ever a conversation about how come there's only men in here from anyone? I don't remember the teacher offering that. I don't remember students offering that. But here's the terrible thing, Julie. Even if somebody had brought that up, I would probably not have noticed it or registered it or thought about it,
Yeah.
because I was just receiving the reading lists that I was given. All credit to whoever was doing the book purchases for the Batesburg Public Library in the 70s and 80s,
I was
because
thinking that.
they had absolutely everything from every science fiction title from Doubleday, for example, which was how I discovered Manly Wade Wellman, for example, with shall we say, profound effect on my career. But but not until I really got wised up as in grad school, which was simultaneous with my nascent fiction writing career. They were simultaneous. I started writing fiction so that I would have something to submit when I was applying to fiction programs, to creative writing programs. And then once I was in the creative writing programs, everything I workshopped, I would be sending out, for publication. And all the women around me, and it was largely women in these programs, so were pointing out to me, well, why that is, and you look at this syllabus, and they were
Mhm.
educating me on all the ways somebody handed me Joanna Russ's How to Suppress Women's Writing, and I read that and I thought, oh my God, I've been suppressing women's writing, but it takes this sort of it takes
Well, when you're,
somebody thumping you on the head.
because it's part of a system. When you're part of a system, it's very hard to see.
That's right.
You know?
It's very hard to see yourself as part of a system that is not doing a lot of good in the world. So that made me then increasingly value the people like Tanith Lee, the people like Angela Carter, the people like Octavia Butler, who had just through sheer talent and willpower and determination, had like repeatedly elbowed their way in and refused to be passed over, ignored, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Russ herself being prominent as a forerunner of these folks, Judith Merrill, and so on and so forth.
There's that old chestnut or saying of nice women are never remembered. It's for a reason, like it's
Yes.
but and it's not just women too. It's many, many groups, as you mentioned. I don't think Tanith did a great job with representation in terms of, ethnicity and race and things like that.
No.
However,
No.
really not. However, in terms of gender and queerness, she did quite a bit and quite a bit earlier than it was generally found. And I
Yes, very much so.
and I wonder if you noticed that as a difference when you were reading her, or if at what point you noticed that.
That came later for me too, because queerness was not something we were encouraged to talk about at St. John's United Methodist Church in Batesburg when I was an adolescent. Uh, um, Much less at my high school, etc. But I started meeting openly gay people of various genders when I was an undergrad, and then later as a newspaper reporter. Um, uh, I was part of a team covering the scourge of the AIDS epidemic in the 80s in Greensboro, North
Really?
Carolina, trying to make people realize that these were human beings, these were families, these were, that this was something everybody should care about. And that was an uphill slog at the time.
Yeah.
Um, but we were doing what we could, and in the process, I was finding out a lot, and again, I was going back into uh, Tanith Lee and Theodore Sturgeon and other writers in the field that had been querying it for some time, and realized, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. But it was like Jess Salmonson. Jess Salmonson's 2-volume edited edition of the works of the queer 19th century writer Fitzjames O'Brien, who died in the Civil War about 10 miles from where I'm sitting right now, killed in a skirmish. Uh, that was one of the texts that really made me think about, oh, there's a queer history in this field that goes back a long way. Um, and and uh, and Tanith was absolutely part of that. What it fascinates me that the looks Tanith chose for herself, not just in that hallway in Baltimore at the con, but also her author photos and so forth. You go to the fan pages devoted to Tanith, and you see
There's one
the
behind me on my
presentation
screen.
there. Yes, you see the presentation. You see the eyeshadow. You see the um it is we understand that now in a way that people may not have so well understood in the 1970s and so forth. It just uh, and her writing is so visual, and her writing is so also sensuous in the orality of it, as I was just saying earlier. And that is so absolutely, that in itself is a queer move. It is not part of the just cut and dried, nuts and bolts, so-called hard SF, whatever that is. Just stick to the plot, give us another formula. That is so a very different. It's the approach of Catherine Moore and Ted Sturgeon and a lot of other people going all the way back.
Would you think it's the approach
But
you take, or is it different? What do you think you got from, what do you think in your work is something you may have noted that
oh,
came
I
through
love
Tanith?
finding I love finding the I love finding the voice that wasn't given voice. And
Yeah.
I think Tanith loved that too. Um, my story, The Potawatomi Giant, uh, came about because I had read a biography of Houdini, and I had read a biography of Jack Johnson, the great fighter. And I read them for some reason back to back with no particular, just randomly, the way you read mostly everything. But Jess Willard showed up in like one page of each book. And
That's
I
interesting.
thought I'd never heard of Jess Willard before, but he had these crucial encounters with two two of the most celebrated figures of the day. Neither very good. One he beat Johnson to win the title. He was the great white hope that the racists had longed for, even though Willard himself was not white. And he had this run in with Houdini at what should have been a uh, purely pro forma sort of photo op moment at a vaudeville theater, and instead picked a fight and started a near riot. And I thought, isn't this interesting? Here's this person that in his day was as celebrated as the president was. And now the only way I know of him is because he's like a footnote in these two biographies of these two much better known people to whom uh, history has been more generous, I suppose.
I
So
know
I thought, I
Rad
wonder what his
bring
story. So what would his story be like? So that's, to me, that's very much, to me, that's a Tanith move, a Tanith type move. I don't claim to be the writer Tanith was. I don't claim to have the knowledge, the level of craft that she does. But I just love that um, all these people that society is passing over, or that society is putting into one category or one box. In her stories, the stories are about them ignoring the box, leaving the box. But it may have something to do with the fact that when I started, and not just in this field, but in higher ed, in creative writing, AWP, what have you, most people don't sound like me, right?
No, I
I
know.
present with a different voice, and that really startled people early on, and may still. But this, maybe this is one reason I so respond to, like, the voices that aren't getting heard for some reason.
Maybe. Maybe it's more than one reason. I mean, maybe you stand out in other ways and you don't even realize it.
True.
But I was gonna bring it round to Tanith's sort of legacy and the fact that is it, she's written 90 books, 300 short stories, and influenced, if you just look at the table of contents of this book, or even everything from China Mieville, who isn't in this book, but to, Martha Wells, to Terry Windling, to you, to, such a broad swath of different kinds of writers. And yet, she's not terribly well known. Um, and
No,
how,
no, she's not. Part of that, I think, is just that she was so prolific. Where do you start? Part of that is that so much of the work is short fiction, which can tend to be ephemeral, if you don't get canonized. And where is the canon now? For example, are we still reading the short stories that were on the Hugo and Nebula and World Fantasy Ballad even 10 years ago? I don't know. It depends. Is the author still around, still busy inflicting themselves on us? That's hard to do. Um, the but I think that that I think that the young writers and the young readers of today, and readers and writers of any age, if they are increasingly fascinated in the things that, like, Victor Laval is doing with the rewrites of Lovecraft. Um, Her name just flew out of my head. Who else is from Baltimore that's also doing the Lovecraft revisions, rethinking? I'll think of her name, and after we're recording, I apologize. Um, people that are reading the uh anything that is about, um, that really darkly interrogates, the have-nots of society, which so much Sam Miller is doing, which so many of today's major writers are doing. I think that they would find a lot to embrace in the work of Tanith Lee, who was doing that sort of thing, a generation ago.
yeah.
Just this. Do you mind if I read a paragraph? This is the first paragraph of Tanith's story, Il est trop la mort, which was in the Whispers 4 volume that came out, has to be 80s, 1983, from Doubleday, one of those Doubleday. Okay, so I'm pretty sure I read this on publication. But this was the first paragraph of it. It's a short paragraph. Across the river, the clock of Notre Dame à Lumière was striking 7. How deep the river, and how dark, and how many bones lying under it, that the strokes of the great gilded clock upon the Gothic tower, winged with its lacework, did not rouse. Down there, all those who had thrown themselves from the bridges off the quays of the city, the starving, the sick and the drugged, the desperate, and the insane. That's the first paragraph. So it's like this cinematic. Here's the beautiful skyline, and then you pass down, and then you get even as the prose is as beautiful as the intricate, intricacies of the architecture. Then you get down to the quays and the rivers and what's floating there, and all the people that have come to the river, and that directs your attention right where Tanith wanted it. What wanted it
It's
directed? The lives and the struggles there.
I was gonna say, and it said the tone is so immediately dark, like emotionally dark, because you immediately, flash to all the way, sort of all the hidden things around you in your own life as well. As far as your
Mhm.
imagination can take you, that setup can like ties to it. And it's really quite, I think that's one of the things that for me, you talk about plot and language, character writers who focus on those kind of being considered somewhat different, is that she somehow managed to write these evocative, you know, beautiful and yet emotionally tight, emotionally really grabbing you immediately. And at the same time, she's also doing setup for plot. She somehow managed to do both.
Mhm.
And that is an incredibly elusive skill,
Mhm.
you know?
Yes.
Like,
And
I wish I could
and
do that.
there's they're so felt, these stories,
Yeah, they are.
line by line, paragraph to paragraph. I mean, we then meet a character who's standing there staring at the water. So we are immediately with that character, don't go in the water, you know. But the and you're right. How do you do all that at once? Well, she did. You
Yeah. And a lot.
the characterization, the plot, the setting, the sound of it, just the visualization, and the message, the repeated message of these people matter. These it's not just the haves, it's the have-nots, and the have-nots do a lot of having too, you know.
The have-nots and the once were's. How about that?
Yes, that's right. The once were's or the never were. But when she wrote about the upper classes, it was very often the upper class rebel, the one who had to break out, the bird in the gilded cage, who had to. Where's there's
Her,
another one. I can't find. I won't be able to find it now. But there's another one about how that uh ends with how they keep looking for the Duchess or whatever, and she had just turned up missing, and nobody ever saw her again because that she like just lit out for the territories.
well, I'll give you one example from her novels because she had so many novels. But first, one of the first Tanith books I read, a lot of you know teenagers read, is the Silver Medal Lover, which was all about a gilded cage.
That's right. Yep.
It's going to be good. I can't wait to see what you bring into the anthology. Is there any work you're doing outside of the anthology that you want to talk about? Go.
I'm doing a lot of nonfiction on like the folklore end of things, like accumulating all the weird stories I can find from my part of the country where I'm living and teaching in Western Maryland and in our part of the Appalachians, which includes southwestern Pennsylvania and the eastern panhandle of West Virginia. And a lot of showing up remarkably enough on some of our university pages here at frostburg.edu. I could send you the link if you want to share that.
I will
But
share it.
but and that's got me on the lecture circuit around here because the libraries want me to come talk and so forth. The one of the libraries asked me to come talk about UFOs, local UFOs, and I said, sure, I can do that. I got material on that.
That's amazing. Yeah, I have to say, there's nothing like a good time slip story, which is how I think of a lot of ghost stories, or sightings as time slips. And I love that idea of like crossing paths with an entirely different world and an entirely different. I'm going to end the interview now because I could keep talking and talking, but it's really been fabulous. I want to thank you joining me, letting me record you.
Well,
And
thanks for involving me.